So next up, we're going to talk about one of the more recent developments or trends or just important ideas in the world of HTML, something called semantic markup. So this is something we'll expand upon in the next few videos. It's nothing crazy or hopefully not very difficult to understand. This visualization here is a huge waste of my time. I don't know why I made it. It's a C-man with a tick. Semantic. Yep. You can tell I sometimes struggle just making these slides alone and then recording these videos alone and editing them alone. I'm all alone, so I entertain myself with horrible slides. I regret it. So here we go. Semantic markup. The term semantic itself, independent of code or HTML, just means something relating to meaning. So semantic markup is meaningful markup, or markup that relates or pertains to the meaning of the content of that element. So I'm going to start by showing you the older non-semantic approach to writing documents. Here is a website that I actually really like. It's medium.com, great blog, and I don't know, is that what you'd call it? Just a blog, sort of writing publication. I don't know. It's a platform for people to write. Now, if we look at it, it looks nice and modern and clean and easy to understand, nice design. But if I open up the DevTools, and I'll make this a bit larger so you can read it better. If we look at what the actual elements are that are being used here, look at that, div, h2, and then div, okay, and then let's keep going down. Let's look at something. I mean, it's not fair if each one of these is a div. Sure, that's all of these right here. But let's look at another part. How about this right here, this section of content? Let's inspect it. Well, if we look at that, we've got a div with a div with a div with another div and a div and a div and an h2 and then a div. This is meaningless markup. Looking at the actual elements here, how would you know what this is supposed to be or what this is or what this is? It's just meaningless. It's just generic divs. They're just containers. Of course, it's styled and it looks nice and it's easy to understand here, but the markup itself is just a whole bunch of divs. Now let's compare that to another website. This is Stripe's website. And I'm going to open this up here. It's got a kind of similar layout in the sense that we have these chunks of content, like a section there, right? We've got this section here. Here's another group of stuff. It's kind of similar. There's some sort of footer at the bottom. There's a navigation thing at the top. And if we look at what Stripe does, we open up the DevTools, we'll inspect. There's still going to be divs, but let's start at the very top. We've got an element here called main. This is a new element we haven't seen. And this element is exactly the same as a div in how it works or what it does, except it just has a different name. And it just means that this is the main content of the page. If we go to Medium, what do we have? Well, just a div. Div. So this is a very simple change, but main indicates this is the main content. Now, we'll talk about why this matters in just a bit, but let's keep going. What do we have next? Oh, we've got a header element. So this also functions exactly like a div, and it's just the header of the page. And if we open that up, what do we have? All right, we've got a div, and then we've got a section of content, a section element, another new element we have not seen. It's exactly the same as a div, but a different name. And then if we open this up, we've got more stuff in here, right? I expanded a couple of other things. Right here, we have nav elements. So navs for navigation, just like divs, but they are called navs. And they tell us what they do. They are meaningful. Compare that to what we have on Medium. I feel bad for ragging on Medium. Obviously, these are very talented developers. What do we have? Div with a div with an h4 with more divs. There's no nav here, but a nav would be perfect. This is navigation. That's all that it's there for. These are navigation links. Why not use an element like a nav? Well, the main reason is that these elements are newer. They're not brand new by any means, but they haven't always been part of HTML. Things like navs and mains and headers and footers. Speaking of footer, if we go down to the bottom of this page, we look at the footer here. It is a footer element. It's an actual footer. That's what it's called. Again, just like a div, but it tells us a bit about what it is. Now, if we look at the footer on Medium, it might be a footer element. Nope, it's just a div. So just looking at this markup, we really can't tell anything about what the content is. Versus over here, we at least have an overview of, all right, we've got a footer at the bottom, we've got a header, we've got a bunch of different sections, so we didn't really hit those yet, but if we look at one of these sections right here, whoops, click that, hover, that's a section of content. Scroll down, we've got another section right there. So instead of just using a generic div, a section makes sense. It's a grouping of content, it's a section of the page. So there are a bunch of these elements that I'm just going to cover pretty quickly because honestly there's nothing to them except for their different names. Header, footer, nav, section, article, main, they all behave just like divs except they have some meaning. So now the question is why? Why does it matter? So there are a couple of reasons. It all comes down to adding meaning to our markup, and that meaning could be meaning for other computers or for an application or a crawler like Google. If Google is writing code that's going to come across all of our markup, or let's say it comes across this markup here for Medium, it's very difficult for that code to quickly figure out, all right, what's navigation content? Where are all the links on this page? If a crawler is trying to find navigation links, often that's what they do. One of the strategies for crawling is just finding all the links in a nav bar or all the links in a footer and crawling those and continuing to visit those pages and do the same thing over and over. Now on this document, it's not immediately clear where the navigation content is, versus here, well, I closed it, but as we saw, it was very easy because it's just called out with the actual element nav. Here's a nav for navigation content. So that's a simple example. The same thing goes for categorizing other pieces of your markup. There are semantic elements for things like even times and dates. There are elements. There's a time element. Code can understand what that is very easily. Instead of if you just had a generic span or a paragraph or something, it doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't explain anything about what it contains. So that's one reason, making your code more crawlable, more friendly to other applications or to other code. The second reason has to do with accessibility and making your code more accessible to people using screen readers, to people who cannot see the rendered content or may not be able to fully see it or might elect to use a screen reader. Those screen readers can look for things like a nav element or a header or a footer or an article, a main, a section. It can use those as hooks. They act as sort of signposts, which is really important because if you're reading this content, that's what a screen reader looks at or is reading out loud, it's just all of this stuff here. How is it going to know where the navigation links are? How will it know where the footer is? So if you're using a screen reader and you want to quickly go to the sign in or you want to go to the about page or you want to go to the careers page, if you're using a screen reader, you would hopefully be able to ask for the footer or the header, or you'd be able to quickly navigate there. And if you use these semantic elements, it makes that far easier. And I'll actually demonstrate that as a little bonus video in this section. And then the third reason that's important is that it just makes your own code, your markup, more navigable for yourself and for other developers. If I'm scrolling through this and I need to figure out, I need to update, the nav links, it's not immediately clear where to do that. Or if I need to update the footer, I've got to open up all these divs and try and figure it out. Versus here, if I need to update the footer, it's pretty obvious. I just look for the footer element, and there we go. So that one's not as important, but it is worth considering. So adding meaning into our markup is the idea behind writing semantic markup. There are a whole subset of elements in HTML which don't do anything that you couldn't do before. So they don't add new features or any new visual, I don't know. There's nothing new about them except that they add meaning to the markup. You use an article or a section or a main instead of div, div, div. So we'll play around with some of these elements up next.